Hello, everyone. How are you doing? Welcome to another episode of the Dr. Will Show. I am your host, Dr. Will. And once again, we have back with us Connie Hamilton. Connie, how are you doing?
Hey, I'm great today. Thanks for having me again, Dr. Will.
Excellent. You're welcome. You are an expert in all things education, so wanted to bring you back. For those who are watching the show and maybe they don't know you on Twitter or didn't see the previous podcast, will you please introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm a curriculum director and elementary principal in a small rural community, Saranac, Michigan. And I just follow the curriculum path and looking at learning targets. And today we're talking about standards-based learning. So that's a great passion of mine.
Awesome. So like you said, we'll be talking about standards-based learning, which I know of, but don't have your expertise. For me, if you would ask me, competency-based is sort of, what I would lean more towards. But today we're talking about standards-based. So what is standards-based learning?
Well, standards-based learning is when a teacher focuses on a particular standard as opposed to a theme or a topic or a text. So, the difference between a standards-based learning component would be like maybe an English teacher that says, in my class, we learn about To Kill a Mockingbird, versus in my class, we learn about how to analyze complex characters. So it's connecting it to an actual standard rather than, like I said, a piece of text or that kind of thing. So with a Common Core, and Texas obviously has their standards as well, it provides common experiences for all students in a particular grade level that we know that they're all intended to learn the same thing because it's standards-based.
Excellent. So then I guess you kind of went into it, talking about it standard-based, but why standards-based learning and why is it relevant and improving student learning outcomes?
Well, it allows for a more concise assessment of what students actually learned. So what I mean by that is, we'll take the To Kill a Mockingbird example again. So if a teacher gives an assessment on To Kill a Mockingbird, one teacher might be saying, who are the characters? What was the theme? Another teacher might say, how does this relate to the other text that we read last year? And so when it's just looking at a particular topic, there isn't a common learning that you want the students to have as a result of, participating in that class. So the piece of literature is what drives the standard as opposed to the other way around.
So when you look at standards, and we're talking about this, what does mastery of a broad range of standards really tell you about what students are learning?
Well, when we take a look at mastery, very oftentimes there are multiple factors that filter into your traditional grade. A lot of times teachers identify mastery based on the grade. But when we take a real hard look at what goes into a grade, it doesn't always reflect what the student has actually learned. So for example, if they didn't turn their assignment in on time, it might be marked down 20% or 50%. Or if they didn't turn it in at all, they get a 0. And that mathematically artificially reduces their grade and therefore gives the illusion that the student hasn't learned, when really what we are showing is that they have poor employability skills or they lack responsibility, but perhaps they still have mastered the standard. So a good indicator of that would be if you're sitting at parent-teacher conferences and the teacher says something to the parent like, well, the grade doesn't really reflect what your child actually knows. That's an indicator that that teacher is perhaps looking at a standard and not necessarily the grade that's, like I said, artificially deflated by behaviors and sometimes artificially inflated by things like, extra credit, bringing in a box of Kleenex, or, you got extra points for neatness, or you turned it in early. Those are all behaviors that aren't related to whether or not you can analyze complex text.
Mm-hmm. So are there any disadvantages to standards-based learning, and what doesn't it tell you about a student?
I think the biggest, if there is a disadvantage, is really about educating people in regards to how this changes. Our society is so accustomed to a traditional grading program. To shift into standards-based is quite a leap. There has been some conversation about universities and colleges looking for grade point average, and how do we make that connection? And I always kind of take a look at, if you're sitting with a kindergarten parent and you say to that kindergarten parent, by the end of the year, we want your child to be able to count to 100. And right now, your child can count to 27 successfully. There isn't a parent alive that says, oh my gosh, my child's failing kindergarten. They don't automatically translate that to a 27% and think that their child is failing. And so we start school kind of standards-based when we take a look at what we're doing in early childhood and early elementary. But at some point, it seems like in most schools, we transition to that ABCD. And then we need parent-teacher conferences to define what that C is, because it doesn't say what your child can actually do and what your child learns.
Mm-hmm. So how does standards-based learning prepare students to be successful in this digital world?
I think it provides some really accurate information to what a student knows and doesn't know. And, we know Hattie says that the biggest indicator of student success is student reporting their own grades and their own success. And so when they know what the target is, if they know what I'm supposed to be learning is how to decompose fractions, then students can better say, yes, I know how to decompose fractions, or I'm getting there, but I still don't understand this piece of it, versus, I have a B in math. That causes a little bit more of a gap in regards to students being more involved. So as students are aware of where their strengths and weaknesses are, then they can utilize all of the resources that are available to them to help fill the gaps and take control of their own learning. We all want lifelong learners. And the only way to do that is to help students to determine what it is that they do know and what they don't know yet.
Okay, so when a school decides we're going in that direction, or let's say a school is already teaching standards-based learning, I mean, that's just how they teach. How does leadership prepare teachers to teach in that manner? And does it limit teacher creativity and ownership in the classroom?
Well, I think the preparation to shift to standards-based is really knowing what your standards are. So, back in the day when you could really teach whatever you wanted before there were standards, and, you got a dinosaur unit for 3 years in a row, I think teachers felt like they had a lot of autonomy because they could teach what it is that they want. In this particular case, to prepare teachers is to make sure that they understand very explicitly what their grade level or what their department is required to teach. And then how they go about teaching that's the art within teaching. So you have consistent outcomes. So, one of the analogies that I like to make is we're all going to Disneyland. Every third grader by the end of third grade is going to make it to Disneyland. And Disneyland is, that's the target. So how are you going to get to Disneyland? Well, you can fly, you can drive, you can take the plane. You can take 3 days to get there. You can take 4 weeks to get there. You can, go through the mountains. You can avoid the mountains. There are a lot of different paths, but so long as every third grader gets to Disney by the end of the year, then we know that they're going to be prepared for, whatever the next trip is when they get to fourth grade, because they all have a common experience of learning that the next year's teacher can then scaffold on. And, you think of, like in my school, we have 3 different 3 or 4 different classes. So, I don't want that 5th grade teacher to say, well, I know that the kids in my class who had Mrs. So-and-so learned this and this and this. And then the kids in my class who had Mr. X, then they learned this and this and this. And now I have to fill in the gaps. When you're standards-based learning, you have an assumption on what every 4th grader has learned. And therefore, you can really be a lot more efficient on your instruction because you know exactly where they left off. There are no gaps.
Okay, so I'm going to throw this out there to you, particularly when we look at standardized testing.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw this on Twitter somewhere where someone talks about how we talk about individualized instruction, but we test everyone in a standard way.
Right.
Which in itself, when you think about it, doesn't make any sense. Well, when you look at standards-based learning and we understand that each student not only comes from a different, maybe pre-K background or social economic background with their parents and how much their parents work with them,
right,
or even students' natural intellectual ability and curiosity, is standards-based learning appropriate for all students when you take into account all of those factors?
Well, yes. I think it's fair to have some sort of a common benchmark, so that, if you do have students who have limited exposure, or they have some disadvantages within their life, or they have some learning disabilities, that we aren't dummying down the expectation to provide a facade that they're being successful. Certainly, we want teachers to differentiate and even individualize, which are 2 different things, to make sure that we meet all students' needs. But at the end of the day, if we want all 3rd graders to have learned these 20 standards, then it's fair to provide an assessment that says, yeah, Dr. Will met these standards, and ooh, Connie didn't quite meet them. How can you differentiate if you don't have a common goal in order to determine where those gaps are? That provides you with that foundation in order to make those decisions and build that differentiation.
All right. So let's get to parents now. Mm-hmm. So your parent comes in and you talk to them about, let's say, grading, particularly when we're looking at mastery and mastering standards. How do you explain that to parents? Particularly, we know standards are like, R5 dash whatever, and it says,
right,
be able to identify X, Y, and Z and those things. How does one begin to explain those standards to parents, and how or whether or not their child actually mastered that standard?
Well, you've hit on that. That's a real challenge, is educating parents in regards to this system. So, going back to the kindergarten example, I think that we begin with that. In kindergarten, we expect students to know X number of sight words. We expect them to be able to read at such and such a level. They can write a full paragraph that includes capital letters and punctuation, et cetera, et cetera. When we speak in those languages to parents to say, this is what we expect a kindergartner to be able to do, parents respond to that. They actually appreciate that, and they don't need an explanation of what does the B mean. And so as we go through the progression, as you sort of alluded to, the standards do get a little more complex. When we're talking about you need to determine the difference between satire, sarcasm, and irony, and a lot of parents are going, oh, yeah, I'm not really sure that I even remember what those differences are, then they do become a little clouded. So there's a couple of different ways that you can approach that. Number one is, here's where your child is progressing on this standard. Here's where your child is progressing on that standard, and give them a continuum for each standard. And then what I have suggested, or what I've read, I guess, is taking a look at if in a 9th grade English class, there are 20 different standards. One standard might be research, and maybe you spend 3 hours looking at research. Another standard might be looking at punctuation, and you might spend 2 class periods on it. It really doesn't matter how much time or how many practice opportunities that you give students to master that standard. Bottom line is, at the end of 9th grade English, there are 20 standards that have to be mastered. And if the student has mastered 15 of those standards, then they have mastered 75% of the standards that are required for 9th grade English. Regardless of how long it took them, how many tries that they had, how it was delivered to them, how the teacher differentiated, all of that is really sort of irrelevant. I think we get wrapped up in, I have 15 assignments, and so I have to average these 15 assignments, but those 15 assignments all measure one standard. Here's another example, is a lot of times elementary teachers will, they teach all subjects. So in math, they may have students who have to write their explanation. How did you get this answer? And then they'll mark points off for not using proper punctuation or not having good sentence structure. And they say, well, I want them to be able to write across the curriculum. Absolutely, we want them to write across the curriculum. But if you're going to mark points down for sentence structure and punctuation, those are writing standards, not math standards. So the evidence collected on that math test that are related to a writing standard should be documented in a standards-based learning system under writing standards, because that's what you're assessing. So you wouldn't mark a student down in their math grade because they didn't write in complete sentences. That doesn't have anything to do with whether or not they can compose and decompose fractions. So you could be perfectly proficient in composing and decomposing fractions, but your sentence structure is junk. Well, then that's a different problem. We're not going to differentiate or remediate or provide an intervention for fractions if really what the student needs is assistance in sentence structure. So standards-based learning helps you to better identify where the student's strengths and weaknesses are, because you are laser focused on what is it that I'm trying to teach, and therefore what am I assessing?
Excellent, excellent. So before we go, I have two things I want to get to. So what is your response to those critics of standards-based learning, particularly those who say teaching kids a more broader terms, as you mentioned earlier, a theme or concept or conceptual based learning better prepares kids for post-secondary opportunities, where at the college level, there isn't a standards-based approach to teaching. It is about conceptual learning and that sort of thing. So what would you say to those critics who say, we don't want to do this here because they won't be confronted with it there?
Right. Well, I guess if you think of it sort of like the big leagues, if you're going to go play in the NBA, you're going to have a coach and it's really going to be all about the final game. But as you're going through, I don't know what the little league version of basketball is, but when you're going through that, you expect a coach to be able to teach the skills individually and in isolation so that students can sharpen that so that they can eventually be an overall great basketball player. And so I don't really see that conflict. I mean, of course, we do want students to be able to put all those skills together at some point, but you can't just say, go be a better basketball player, and just continue to say that over and over. At some point, you need to say, okay, student, you need to work on your dribbling. Okay, student, you need to improve in your passing. Okay, student, your footwork is really an area where we're going to really hone in on here. And as a result of all that, you're going to overall be a better basketball player. Really, where I see or where we hear on Twitter or in the world, the conflict with standards-based learning, or the resistance, is really about those soft skills. And there's some legitimacy to that need to make sure that we're building good team players, students who can collaborate, students who can think critically, who are responsible, who do turn their things in on time. Those are legitimate skills. Unfortunately, Common Core doesn't identify those as things that we directly teach. And so a lot of schools have opted to segregate those assessments or those grades as they're reported. And so here's your grade on what you were supposed to learn, and here's your grade on how you went about learning it. And so that provides two pieces of information, like, yeah, you tried really hard, you worked, you came in, you did extra work, you were open to interventions, you get an A for effort, or whatever you want to call that employability grade. However, no matter how hard you tried, I'm sorry, but you still didn't quite meet the standard. I mean, I'm never going to be a pro basketball player. I could practice my hiney off. I'm just never going to be that good. I don't have a talent in that area. And so I don't want my effort to then give me this impression that I can make a career out of playing basketball, because I won't be able to pay my bills. And so that's where I think it's going to be really important, is to make sure that we do still recognize that those are important skills, and how can we still make sure that we're sending people off into the workforce who are going to be good employees. And I'm not sure that clouding grades is the best way to do that, but I do think that it's important to include both.
Awesome. Y'all did not know that Connie was going to lay it down like that today. I like that. So before we leave, what are your final thoughts? What is the impression you would like to leave upon those who are still on the fence about whether or not standards-based learning is something they need to either investigate more, or if they're in the process of sort of changing what is going on in their school, that this is something that they really need to say, let's really bring this into our school?
I would say, as a warning, don't jump in too fast. Make sure you have all your ducks in a row before you go down this path, because if you don't have a good, solid understanding of what standards-based learning is, if you say, well, we're just not going to give homework, or we're not going to count homework or whatnot, it's really not going to be successful. So Rick Wormley, Ken O'Connor are a couple of the big names who have some really great stuff. Wormley has some YouTube videos that are short and concise and really get to the point. And of course, Ken O'Connor has those 15 fixes for broken grades. Those are good places to start to open up people's minds in regards to, what does a zero do? Always kind of cracks me up is when you have missing information, we default to a zero, meaning if we don't have data that says what a student has learned, we assume they've learned nothing, which kind of cracks me up that, a teacher would assume a kid got zero. So I would say tread slowly, make sure that your teachers have a very good understanding and can communicate the philosophy of standards-based in a positive way. But definitely this needs to begin with teachers, not with the community. Teachers really need to have a good understanding, and then make sure that parents are aware of the shift as well.
Awesome. As always, people, Connie is excellent. I was just sitting here. I'm getting an education today. This was fantastic, and I hope everyone will watch the show and give a shout to Connie on Twitter and ask her, more questions. Thanks, Connie, for coming back on the show, and we need to have you back, because every time, I'm serious. This is awesome. So again, people, thanks again for watching the Dr. Will Show. As always, be you, EDU. Have a good one.
Thanks.